seen the glory of the flame of women's
The Seneca
grace.
Falls Convention gave women around the nation a voice in public settings to speak against the injustices enforced on women at the time. Women and men came together to discuss the actions needed to be inflicted on the government in order to achieve equality. Radical movements such as the abolition movement gained popularity by introducing ideas that challenged societal beliefs about race and equality. Mainly organized by Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, 300 men and women met in the Wesleyan Chapel in Seneca, New York during the July of 1848. These women amazed their audience with their bold opinions, which helped them gain supporters and signatures for the Declaration of Sentiments. In the early 20th century, during a time of radical revivals, ideas on women's rights rose at the Seneca Falls Convention, which altered women's roles in society and helped them gain the right to vote.
Following the abolition movement, the Seneca Falls Convention encouraged radical change that gave women a voice in society. During the London Anti-Slavery Convention of 1840, 8 abolitionist women from America, representing the American Anti-Slavery Society, were denied the right to participate in the meeting, leaving them to sit in the spectators' gallery. Some European and American men at the meeting believed women would be a distraction and that it was unfeminine for them to share their opinions publicly, so 90% of them voted to deny the women's right to be seated. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was outraged by the outcome and said that as abolitionists they had been compelled to fight both church and Bible to prove the black man's right to liberty. Conscience forbade them to stretch those sacred limits far enough to give equal liberty to women. Her rage on the misogynistic criticism prevailed, as she spoke on how many abolitionist men supported race equality, yet they felt superior to the women at the meeting. Wendell Phillips and Henry Lloyd Garrison, both abolitionists in America, felt the same way as Stanton, but they predicted that demanding for a seat would be very difficult. Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, angered by their exclusion from the meeting, agreed to host their own convention for women's rights. Some people thought these two women held unconventional and unobtainable views, but others learned to become more self-aware of the injustices which occurred. Mott and Stanton wrote letters to each other, sharing their deep interest in feminism and desire to take action. Stanton and Elizabeth McClintock invited many well-known female abolitionists, including Lydia Maria Childs, Maria Weston Chapman, and Sarah Grimke, who were known for their bold beliefs for equality. Frederick Douglass, a leading figure in the abolition movement, participated in the convention, making him the only African-American attendee. News of the convention spread through newspapers and word of mouth, and the convention quickly gained recognition as public entertainment during this period was restricted to lectures, meetings, and debates.
Without radical demands by feminists, women's rights would have been silenced and ignored by the public. No matter the consequences to their reputation, through declaring opposition to their government, they established their determination to end the discrimination of women. Stanton introduced the rough draft of the Declaration of Sentiments to the participants. Only women were allowed on the first day to give them a perspective of what was expected out of this meeting. They made their main goal to earn women the right to vote in the U.S. elections. Part of the Declaration was dedicated to this idea, which states, resolved, that is the duty of the women of this country to secure to themselves their sacred right to the elective franchise. Being unfair to men, it was the responsibility of women to change the hypocritical U.S. democracy by allowing both genders to vote in elections. On Thursday morning, with James Mott, the chair of the meeting, Stanton read aloud the declaration after several attendees such as Lucretia Mott, Ansel Bascom, S.C. Woodward, Thomas and Mary Ann McClintock, Frederick Douglass, Amy Post, and Catherine Stebbins reviewed it. Many criticized several resolutions because they were seen as unattainable or too ludicrous for the time period. But majority vote prevailed and the resolutions were agreed upon to add to the declaration. Alluding to the Declaration of Independence, they also list grievances within the sentiments. These many grievances demonstrated the powers men held above women in order to keep them in their subordinate life. For example, he has denied her the facilities for obtaining a thorough education. This represents how he, referring to the government, denied women the right to obtain an education. With women being denied an education, they grew up in a society feeling outspoken and less important compared to men. In another way to correct the Declaration of Independence to fit their demands, they attested, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal." With the addition of women in the statement, they impose a bold change on the government's original document. A quote representing the extreme views of the attendees at the meeting states that, by tying the complaints of women to the most distinguished political statement the nation had made, Stanton implied that the women's demands were no more or less radical than the American Revolution had been. They were, in fact, an implicit fulfillment of the commitments already made. Clearly stating that they want to earn the right to vote, women at the time were seen as nonsensical. One famous advocate of the time, Frederick Douglass, gave a few words to show his appreciation to the cause. He was one of the 100 attendees who signed the Declaration of Sentiments, which consisted of 68 women and 62 men. Douglass included the Declaration of Sentiments in his newspaper, the North Star, to show his support for the women. After receiving the signatures, people such as Stay and Amy Post in the McClintocks were involved in preparing the bold draft of the Declaration to present to Congress.
Presenting the draft to Congress and the public was only the beginning of many years filled with protests and reforms that paved the way for women gaining their ultimate goal of voting. Susan B. Anthony, who was arrested for illegally voting, portrayed the radical side of obtaining women's rights after the convention. The government documentation from her indictment illustrates her determination to fight for women's rights despite society's disapproval. In an image published by Harper's Weekly in 1859, women were mocked and criticized for their ideas on voting. The image was a negative representation of Seneca Falls Convention, and it illustrated men poking fun at the women and fooling around during their speeches. Also, as another form of mockery, a group of individuals produced a parody of the women's rights movement with sheet music produced by Kate Horn that ridiculed the women's rights activists. The insulting and sarcastic lyrics scorn the ideals of women's rights, including their role at home. The lyrics state, "'Tis woman's right to rule the house and petty troubles brave, but not her right to rule the head and treat him as her slave." They claimed the women were demanding such psychotic measures, they were practically asking to have the right to overpower their husbands. For years following the convention, people continued to ridicule feminist ideals, while other women joined the movement and fought for their right to vote. With much negative feedback, the convention also received some positive responses, such as the 1897 Geneva Political Equality Club. Anne Fitzhugh Miller, the president of the club, sent invitations informing people from the club to discuss topics on women's rights, specifically the grievances expressed at the convention. Discussions represented a form of female political groups where they could speak freely about topics many other political groups wouldn't spend time on. This gave women the chance to become involved in politics and gave them enough determination to want to change their current political system for one with female representation. Although many people expressed negative feedback on the convention, the positive attributes outweighed this ridicule by illustrating a lasting legacy. In reality, the dismissive judgment, primarily on the right to vote, only brought more attention to the issue, which helped spark even further debate and knowledge to people around the nation.
The movement focused on giving women the right to vote, along with several other controversial long-term goals which were eventually obtained. With these radical goals came opposition. Women in Georgia and other southern states opposed the movement because they were worried to be a threat to slavery. A petition was developed in 1913 by a group of women in Georgia who cared more about money and the continuation of slavery than their own rights. The petition reads, "We believe that the proposed amendment is dangerous and hurtful to the best interests of our country, and especially to the South, in that the inevitable result of the legislation proposed would be to destroy white supremacy and states' rights." At the time of the abolition movement and women's suffrage movement, many southern states feared the end of white supremacy and slavery because it brought great profit to the South. The underlying racism within the nation fueled further opposition to the women's rights movement. As women's suffrage spread largely across the country, some people still did not support the movement and argued that the government should not pass the 19th Amendment. The anti-suffrage party formed, and they wrote letters to the Senate claiming women were not political figures and should stay within their social spheres. The petition argues, "Our country in this hour of peril should be spared the harassing of its public men and the distracting of its people from work for the war." The party believed that women would be intrusive in the government and were not capable of making such decisions for the nation, especially during World War I, when the nation was most vulnerable. Intense opposition continued to emerge from women's determination to secure the right to vote, stemming from the Seneca Falls Convention many years earlier. But the movement and its advocates overpowered their opposition, leading to states giving women the right to vote around 72 years after the initial meeting. On August 18, 1920, Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify the 19th Amendment, or Susan B. Anthony Amendment, which was added to the Constitution. Out of the states that ratified, many were in the West because many Western states wanted women to move there to grow the population. A.H. Roberts, governor of Tennessee, added in his statement to government regarding the 19th Amendment that declaring that the right of the citizens to vote should not be decided by the United States or by any state of sex. Many people in opposition eventually supported the idea of women voting because they wanted to guarantee white supremacy and neutralize black voting. Another long-term achievement was the Equal Rights Amendment, or Lucretia Mott Amendment, which was added in 1982. Named after the founder of the meeting, this goes to show how these two women left a lasting positive impact on the women's rights movement. Coming together through protests and gatherings, women were able to gain a political voice and equal stance in society with men. The Seneca Falls Convention Convention not only helped women obtain rights, but it also illustrates that when a societal flaw is evident, it is up to the people to use their democratic rights and bring a change to better the nation as a whole.
Expected us to change ourselves with every passing style. Said the only work for women was to clean and type and file. That's why we're marching on.